Welcome everyone, I'm Jeff Smith, Product Manager for Oracle REST Data Services, or ORDS, and today I'm going to take you through how to install ORDS and make RESTful Web Services available for your Oracle database. So the reasons why you might want to install ORDS, like I said, you want RESTful Web Services for your database, but you might also want to have the web or the REST APIs for the JSON Document Store, or SODA. That's where you treat the Oracle database as a repo for JSON collections and documents, sort of the MongoDB methodology. We also offer management APIs for the database itself. So if you want to use HTTP to do things like create a pluggable database, or get a list of locked accounts, or check wait events in the database, or schedule a data pump job via HTTP, then ORDS provides that as well. About 500 different RESTful web services there for actual management of the Oracle database. We also provide SQL Developer Web. So if you love SQL Developer on your desktop for running your queries and you want to have that same experience in your browser, then we have SQL Developer Web, which is a single page app that's deployed via ORDS, and it's backended by REST APIs. Surprise, surprise, provided by ORDS. So it's got management features, query features. It's also got a fully baked REST development environment in there for the REST services deployed by ORDS. And then finally, ORDS is available as a web listener for the database. So that's where you kick off a stored procedure, it prints off some HTML, and it comes back to your screen. And the biggest use case for that, of course, is to make Application Express or APEX work. So what I'm going to do is a very simple install where APEX is not involved. However, I know there's a ton of users out there using ORDS for APEX, and so I'm going to provide a link to a great quick how-to by Joel Coleman, our APEX co-creator, and he's got a really nice unintended install getting started for both ORDS and APEX in like just a couple of minutes. So when you got ORDS up and running, it's going to be running probably in a mid-tier somewhere, and it's going to be sitting there waiting for HTTP requests that get routed to it, and it's going to say, oh, Jeff's wanting to do something, do some amount of work in this specific database, and it knows how to map that to the workload, in this case a stored procedure, or maybe it's a SQL statement to make that happen. And it's going to get the response from that work, and it's going to write it back as an HTTP response with the proper status codes and links, and of course the body of the response is going to be a nice JSON document. And I can set these up and have these going, all written in the language of the database itself, SQL and PL SQL. I don't have to be a Java gearhead. As a Java application, you have your standard command line interface. ORDS is deployed as a WAR file, so you'll download ORDS from oracle.com/rest. It's in a zip file, you'll unzip it, and then from a bash command prompt, you would say something like java jar ords.war and then the command. So you could say install, or you could say help, and help would give you the list of commands. Of course, you could also go to the documentation and read all about it. But primarily, you're going to use the command line interface for doing the install or an upgrade, changing a configuration setting, or adding additional databases. So ORDS isn't just for a single database, although you can have ORDS used for just a single database. But most of our customers have ORDS servicing multiple databases. And in our Oracle Cloud, we have single ORDS instances managing hundreds of Oracle databases, so it's quite robust. What's the installer going to do? Well, the first thing it's going to do if you don't have one is help you set up your configuration directory, and that's just where all of the files are going to be. And in those files, you're going to have all of your switches and flags and settings for ORDS itself. And then you're also going to have a directory of XML files that configure everything we need for the connection pools, which tell us the databases that are being used and the accounts and passwords we need to get into those databases. Don't worry, the passwords are encrypted in those files. Obviously, you want to treat these files securely to make sure that they're locked down with the proper read-write access. The other thing the installer is going to do is we're going to go into a database and we're going to look for these two schemas, ORDS public user and ORDS metadata. ORDS public user is just used for the Java or the JDBC connection pool connections themselves. So when ORDS gets a request and it needs to go do work in a database, it has that connection to that database and it's going to be connected as ORDS public user. The brains of ORDS itself is going to be stored in the ORDS metadata schema, which is a collection of 30 tables, about the same number of views, and a whole bunch of PL SQL package APIs. So when you REST enable a table, that's done via PL SQL call. That PL SQL at the end of the day is living in this ORDS metadata schema. And then when you're done with the installer, at the end it's going to say, hey, do you want to run in standalone mode? And if you say yes, you can go straight over to your browser and pull up the base URL, which would be the server, the port, which defaults to 8080, and then /ords. Now, if you don't have it set up for Apex, nothing's actually mapped to the base URL. So you're going to get a 404, but if you see the ORDS logo in the corner, then you know that the embedded web server is running. And then if you want to actually see stuff, that's when you need to go start publishing web services, and then you can start calling those. If you had set up ORDS for Apex, you could go to the web server port /ords and you get the Apex login page. So if you don't already have Tomcat or Apache running and you just want to run ORDS in your mid-tier and have it be on its own, we provide an embedded Jetty web server. We recommend that you set this up for HTTPS, and we will generate a self-signed certificate for you. However, I do recommend you go someplace like Let's Encrypt and get yourself a real certificate. The installer is going to be set up for a single database out of the box, but again, you can go back and add as many additional databases as you want. I would say the most common deployment we have out there is Tomcat, just because of how ubiquitous Tomcat is, not to mention how free it is. It does provide a good bit of features in terms of like maintaining and monitoring and performance tuning your config. And then we have a good number of Oracle customers that have already invested in WebLogic. So if you have that sitting around, that's really nice because it's quite easy to plug into things like your Active Directory setup for users. In either case, when you run the ORDS installer and it asks you for the config directory, that's burned into the WAR file. So you can go install and set up config ORDS as a standalone program, and then when you're done, take that whole collection of stuff and just dump it into Tomcat or WebLogic and you're good to go. All right, I really recommend you read the documentation for this topic, but if you're in a multi-tenant environment, you need to decide if ORDS is going to be a CDB level install or a PDB level install. On the CDB level install, the ORDS public user is created as a common user in the CDB, and then ORDS metadata goes into each PDB. When I say PDB level install, it's almost just like a normal install. It's only going to be installed directly at each pluggable database level. So when I say it provides maximum flexibility, that's because you could have 10 PDBs, 10 ORDS installs, and each of those ORDS are different versions to have different sets of configuration settings, etc. However, if you have a container database with 100 pluggables in it and you want ORDS across all of those, you could do that in a single install with the container install. But when you go to do an upgrade, everybody gets upgraded. There are pros and cons to both of these. I would say if you're just kicking the tires and just getting started, if you're in a multi-tenant environment, start with the pluggable level install. All right, so let's get going. Again, please read the installation guide first. There are going to be a series of questions in there, and if you don't know the answers, don't guess. Go back to the docs, read that, and then make the appropriate decision. Now I am going to do an install right now, and I'm going to take you through each and every question. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've unzipped the download and I have that WAR file. You can see it's fairly big because it's got SQL Developer Web in it. And I'm just going to say Java jar ords war install. So it wants to know where to place the configuration data, so I need to give it a directory. And this directory doesn't have to already exist. If it's not there, we'll create it for you. And now it's going to start asking me about the database that we're going to work with. So where is that database? Now on my Mac, I have an Oracle database running in a Docker image. So I'm just going to say localhost. This is the database listener port. So where's the database service going? It's on 1521. So that bracketed stuff, that's the default. I can just hit enter. Service or SID. I'm in a PDB, so I do need to use the service name, so I'm going to say 1, and the service name is ORCL. Now you might think, hey, is this a trick question? I thought you said we were going to create this user. How am I supposed to know the password for it? No. You're telling us what you want the password to be. So that's going to be written to some config files, and generally you won't need to know it after this point. But if you do have password complexity rules, you do need to give us a password that's sufficiently complex to pass the rules. And depending on the version of Oracle you're dealing with, these passwords can be case sensitive. And generally when we're working with passwords, you'll get prompted twice. Okay, so the level of privileges required to do an ORDS install is quite high. You're going to need help from your DBA if you're not the DBA. I recommend sysdba level access again because that ORDS public user gets proxy connection privilege for REST enabled schemas, and a DBA role is not enough to do that. So you don't have to use sys, but just to make this easier, I am going to use sys. So it's asking me, do we want the PL SQL gateway? Remember, you need this if you're going to use Apex. We are not going to use this. So for the first time, I'm going to say 2 to skip. Now we have some ORDS specific features. Do we want to use SQL Developer Web? If not, would we like to use the REST enabled SQL? Or would we like the database API? Or would we like a combo of the REST enabled SQL and the database API? I'm going to choose the default, which is SQL Developer Web, which also requires everything else. Now you could hit 5 here and just get base ORDS and just have the RESTful web services for your schemas themselves. You'll see that it's creating these users. Also, it's writing this information to the log file. If you have any problems, support is going to ask for the log file. So keep an eye on the log file. Okay, that went pretty quick. It looks like it did it in like 13 seconds, which is nice. So it's done with the install, and we can hit 2 to exit now, or we can hit 1 to start ORDS. I'm going to hit 1. Do we want to run HTTP or do we want to run HTTPS? All right, so this is on my laptop, on my local database, on my local network. I'm cool to do HTTP to keep things simple. However, if you're in an environment where you're not in total control of the network, and even if you are, you probably want to do HTTPS. That's end-to-end encrypted web traffic. You're going to have stuff coming in and out of your Oracle database, so don't mess around with this. If I hit 2 for HTTPS, we will generate that self-signed cert for you. I'm going to go with 1 because this is just me on this box. All right, so the ORDS process is now running on my machine. And if we scroll up, there's a couple of bits of info here. So the connection pool for our first database is called this. It says Apex, but it's not for Apex. That's just a historical artifact, basically. And then we have a bunch of settings printed out here. These are the defaults for ORDS. You see we have some options turned on and off, and there's some warnings down at the bottom. Some of these are important warnings. This one is saying JDBC max limit in the pool is using a value of 10. That's saying that as the activity spools up, ORDS is going to max out at 10 connections to the database. So once you have 10 active things running and the 11th request comes in, it has to sit there and wait till one of those other 10 processes is done, and then it gets its turn. So properly sizing the connection pools, that is not a trivial exercise. If we go into ORDS config 2, we can see the files that have been put down by the installer. So saying yes to some of these questions had some of these flags get turned on and off. We can change these if you want. If you do change these, you do need to shut down ORDS and restart it for it to read the new settings. If we go into standalone, we can see there's a properties file here. This has like the Jetty settings, so you can see here that the port is set to 8080. If we look at the conf file or directory, you're going to have one XML file in here for each connection pool. The default one is called apex underscore publicuser.xml. This is where you have that ORDS public user defined and its password. Again, you can see that it's encrypted here, so I can't tell what it is. All right, so ORDS is running and it's listening on port 8080, which tells us in here somewhere. Yeah, right here. So localhost 8080 ORDS. All right, so this is that 404 I was telling you about. Nothing in my database has actually been published, so there's nothing to actually show. Jetty's running. It's saying you asked for something, I don't have anything to give you, but here's our nicely formatted 404 page. So when you see this, if you're not running Apex, this is good. This means that ORDS is going. What you need to be able to do to start doing REST stuff in ORDS is you need a REST enabled schema. So if we look at, let's just use HR because heck, why not? Everyone else does. In SQL Developer, we're smart enough to see that ORDS is installed. So you can right click on a connection and you can say enable REST services. This does a couple of things. One, it tells ORDS that the HR user is allowed to publish REST services. This schema alias, what I type here is what's going to go in the REST services URLs. So if I don't want the world to know I have a schema called HR, I need to call this something else. And generally you don't want these to be uppercase because that's not polite in the web world. But if I put ABC in here, when I look at the REST services published under HR, it's going to be ORDS/ABC. But by default, we go with the actual schema name. And then this authorization required, this determines whether or not you need to be authenticated to get a inventory of all the APIs on the schema or not. So I'm going to turn this off. Here is that PL SQL API call we were talking about. So the ORDS metadata schema has a package in there called ORDS, and that has a public synonym. So ORDS.enable schema is telling the ORDS infrastructure that the HR user is allowed to publish stuff, and it's accessed in a base path pattern of this lowercase HR. So I'm going to say finish. Cool. So since I have SQL Developer Web, and since I have a REST enabled schema, I can launch SQL Developer. Now the other thing REST enabling a schema does for SQL Dev is it enables database authentication. So I can come in as HR. Now my HR user has lots of privs, many more than your normal database user. So I've got some cool features in here. One of which is this, the REST workshop. So I don't have anything yet, it's empty. And I have this little tour I can take that will show me how to use it if I want, but I'm going to skip the tour. I'm going to say, let's go create a service. So we can create something just very simple and be nice and document these if you want. So with the module created, we now need to create a template. I'm going to say employees slash. And then with that template, I'm going to need some handlers. So my REST handler is going to be a get of type query. I'm going to say select star from employees and say create. Oh, look at that nasty typo. So I'm going to copy this, open it, and there's my employees. If we wanted to change this, we could say order by salary descending. And save. I can also test this from here too. So I can see my records come back. All right, so if I come back over here and refresh, I've got my most expensive employee listed first now. All right, so if we come back to here, ORDS is running. Now what I want to do probably in the real world is set up a task when the OS boots up to kick off ORDS, and I probably want to redirect standard output to some log files. I haven't done that yet, so if I ever ran into like a server error, like a 500, that would get printed here. Otherwise, I could close this, install Tomcat, and then take that WAR file and drop it in there and run ORDS via Tomcat. So that was an install, a little bit of background, and a quick demo of building and running a RESTful web service. If you want to learn more, definitely recommend the docs, and you can get to that also via oracle.com/rest. You're watching my YouTube video, so I have a whole slew of other ORDS videos, some short, some much longer. I also highly recommend Tim Hall's articles over on Oracle Base, and he does cover things like installation. And if you're a Twitter nerd like me, you can follow us at Oracle Rest. So thanks everyone, have a good day, and we'll see you later.